Welcome to the Mad and Crip Theology podcast. We are so happy that you're here with us today, and we are excited to be speaking with one of our contributors to the spring 2023 issue of the journal. So, welcome.
Thanks. It's so good to be here. I am really happy to be on this podcast. I've admired it for a while and so proud to be published in the journal. I am speaking anonymously due to my family situation. I talk a lot about my family in this piece, and the nature of the situation requires me to remain anonymous. But really happy to be here and talk more about the piece I wrote. Thanks, Amy. Thanks, Miriam.
Yeah, we're so glad we're so excited when we saw your piece come in. I think I did a bit of a happy dance maybe when I saw it come in. We're just so grateful that you took some time out of your day to come and talk to us today.
Thanks.
We wondered if you might begin by telling our listeners about the piece, in case they haven't read it yet or they read it a long time ago.
Yeah, totally. So I write as a mad lesbian Christian, and I wrote this piece on care and control about the relationship between so many mad and disabled folks who need care, and how a lot of the people who provide care to mad and disabled folks exert a lot of control over the way in which that care is provided. And I talk a lot about how a lot of things that can seem caring, in addition to kind of interpersonal care, which is what most of the piece is about. But I also talk about other things, how other things we call care are really control. Things like being in the care of the police, that's not care, that's control. Things like being in the foster care system, again, that's not care, that's control. Our healthcare system, for so many of us, that's not care, that's control. And so when we start thinking about that in systemic ways, we can also apply it to interpersonal relationships. A big part of the piece, I talk about my relationship with my mom, who's an adult child of alcoholics, and the high need that she has for control and that she had in control for my life growing up, how she controlled pretty much every facet, everything I did. She was our, Girl Scout troop leader. She was our youth group leader. She homeschooled me, all these different elements of my lives. I recently learned my mom shared with one of my siblings that her favorite time in our lives as kids was the time when we were homeschooled and before we interacted with the outside world, which lines up exactly with what I'm talking about in this piece, this high need for control that she had. And talking about how when my mom was a kid, a child of alcoholics, the oldest child, care was control for her. She had to be in control of her surroundings in order to keep her and her siblings safe. And she has chosen to never grow out of that reality, even when it no longer became true. And so I talk about how my relationship with my mom, especially as an adolescent and young adult, was very contentious, but was especially contentious when I was doing better, quote, more stable. So the more kind of help or care I needed, the more kind my mom was to me, the more patient, the more generous, the more willing she was to visit me and spend time together. Whereas the more independent that I was, the more challenging our relationship was, the more contentious, the more we had arguments. And really realizing that even though she was being kind to me, kind of interpersonally again, when I was needed a lot of care, it came with a lot of condescension, kind of with this assumption that I could not live my life without her, that I needed this care and should accept this care in whatever way she chose to offer it. And then when I was more independent, our relationship struggled because she had less control over my life. And so kind of seeing how these two things tied together for a lot of mad and disabled folks who do need a lot of care, and the ways that we're really not allowed to have care on our own terms. I also talk a little in my kind of the blurb I wrote for the piece in the journal about how this piece felt important to me to write because so frequently caregivers for mad and disabled people are kind of idolized as like these angels, these perfect, sinless beings who are doing, suffering so much and caring for these people. And we're not allowed to critique that care because the narrative is, oh, how could you possibly say anything bad about this person who's dedicated their life to making sure that you survive, kind of with this implication that you're such a burden, and burdens don't get to care about the people who keep them alive. And so it really felt important to be, critical in a healthy and fair way in this piece to say that, no, actually, we get to talk back to our caregivers as mad and disabled people, we get to have something to say about the care that we receive, and we deserve to have care on our own terms. I'm kind of ending with this understanding that real autonomous care is interdependent. And that's the kind of care that I've learned from other mad and disabled people. That's how other mad and disabled people have taught me that we keep each other alive. We each need things from each other. We all need each other. We all have gifts that we can offer each other in this community. And that kind of interdependence is what I say is the gospel message here, is the good news for me. The good news that there is another kind of care that we can offer each other that's not condescending, that's not controlling, and that is interdependent care.
Thanks so much for that. We really appreciate your summary there. And I think we'll come back to this idea of interdependence in a little bit, because that might be a new word for some of our listeners. So we'll come back to that. We wanted to ask you a question about this idea about coming out as mad. So when did you first come out as mad to yourself and to your friends and community?
So I really came out to myself, at least when I was a young adult. I've been hospitalized twice for being a mad person, trying to make it in this world. And the second time that I was hospitalized, I lost my job. And I was in the hospital and was away from work, and I had just started work. I didn't have any sick time built up. It was a new job, no PTO. And I, come out of the hospital, and what do you need in a crisis? You need stability and resources. And instead, I came out of the hospital to no job and no, income, but also no stability. And I did realize in that moment that a real sense of solidarity, I think. And it does remind me of the quote, and Miriam Kaba talks about this: let this radicalize you and not lead you to despair. And it was this real moment for me of kind of being radicalized and saying, like, wow, I'm in solidarity with so many other mad and disabled people who've been punished for existing as ourselves in the world, who have been lost their jobs, who have been denied resources, who've been denied access. I'm actually coming into this community here. There are so many people like me who have this experience. So that's really when I got into disability theology in a big way. I read Nancy Eastland's The Disabled God was my entry point. I think it is perhaps the best entry point into disability theology, at least as it exists right now. So that really kind of connected me theologically to this idea of disability and a broader disability community. And she talks so beautifully, and really almost the first 2/3 of that book about the disability rights movement, and really kind of grounded me in a history of a community. And so it came out to myself as disabled then, and since then have done a lot of work on disability theology, and really only came into the language of madness within the countering it in some of the disability spaces that I was in, and really feeling a connection to the non-medicalized way of talking about the way that my mind and body exist in the world, kind of in the same way that a lot of disabled folk about the madness really encapsulated not only kind of the challenge done in the medical model, but also the gifts that I bring to the world as a mad person who has a different perspective and can understand the world in ways that sane people just cannot. And so madness for me is the language that allows me to bring my full self to not only my work, but also other aspects of my personal and professional life.
Thanks for that. That's such a great summary of how you moved towards accepting your madness. So thank you so much. I wanted to just ask as a follow-up, were your friends cool with this sort of like change in you, maybe incorporating some of the mad pride into your identity?
I feel like the question I get the most is like, what the hell is mad? Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
So I feel like when I kind of explain it to people, and especially with this language of talking about kind of not just a deficit model and comparing it to kind of a social model of disability, I think that's an easier access point. Really dominates at least the world that I live in. And so kind of trying to tease out for people, connections between like stigma, but also things like saneism, kind of more overarching, contextualized ways that I understand myself. And so I think it's kind of a a learning curve for most folks I talk to. Most folks I talk to in my community, even in my disability community, don't know what Mad Pride is, aren't familiar with the movement. But once I explain it, are really on board. I would say for the most part, I would say there are still some people who are like, how could that ever be a good thing? Doesn't it suck that your mind's broken? I feel like those are the people who are always going to feel that way, no matter what language I use. But those people don't stick around in my life very long.
Know the feeling.
Yeah.
I wondered if I could circle back to you talk about the sense of care when you're more vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder, I'm doing some work among care now, and some disability status people challenge this idea that you have to be nice all the time to receive the care you need to survive, right? And then so you would challenge that too.
Yeah, totally. I I think a lot about how we need more mediocre disabled people, like more representation of disabled people.
Yeah, not so many super good people who are nice and pleasant all the time.
I think maybe we lost her.
I'm gonna pause.
Sounds good.
People like living their lives, and I think that's the same kind of idea for us, or at least express our care is equitable and not all care is fair or just.
Yeah, so you were talking about more mediocre disabled people.
Yeah, this idea that a lot of our disability representation is like perfect disabled people, like brilliant thinkers, brilliant writers, incredible athletes, like hilarious comedians. And like most disabled people are just like pretty boring and like, have bad days and are like not always very nice and like, piss each other off and make mistakes and like, also have moments of being, brilliant, incredible human beings. But I feel like we don't get a lot of kind of mediocre disability representation. We always have to be either great, incredible, brilliant, or we're cast as these, horrible burdens on, the world. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from in this piece too, is like, that's also true for our caregivers, like we're only told that caregivers are perfect, but like caregivers are also often mediocre, right? Like at best, and can have bad days and be mean and really just kind of trying to be honest about like the humanity of this relationship and the, frailty of so many of us in high stress situations and how, we should be able to talk back about the kind of care that we receive.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. And going for that too, like what does sacred care look like between two mediocre people? between mediocre people and God. Like, how does God care for you?
Yeah, I love this question. So one story that I tell in my piece is about me and one of my dear friends. We're both disabled. I frequently say that I have learned how to survive as a disabled person only from other disabled people. no one else is invested in my survival as a disabled person except for other disabled people, right? The world is not made for us to thrive. And so this is one of the people from whom I've really learned to survive as a disabled person. And she's blind and I'm mad. And we have shown up for each other in interdependent mutual care in a lot of ways. And that's when I think of sacred care, I think about things like autonomy and agency and mutuality and, you know, tenderness and respect. And we've shown up for each other in all of those ways in sacred care. And one example of this is it was pretty early on in the pandemic, and she had just gotten back from traveling and she needed to go get a COVID test. And I was having a day where I just felt really disconnected from reality, really kind of in my own world, did not want to be alone, didn't really trust myself to make decisions that were good for me. And so it was this moment of I really needed to not be alone. And she could not get a COVID test on her own because she couldn't navigate to the test site. And so it was this day of us being together, me leading her to the COVID test site or accompanying her, and her accompanying me and grounding me in this moment where I did not feel myself. And that to me is this understanding of interdependent, mutual, sacred care, is this understanding that we need each other, right? That no caregiver doesn't also have needs. No care recipient doesn't also have gifts, right? Like it's just a lie to say that there are human people who don't need other human people. It's just not true. And so recognizing the ways that we need each other and the ways that we can offer each other care. And to me, that's what sacred care looks like, is acknowledging the sacredness of our humanity, which just involves need. I really love Deborah Creamer has in her work on disability theology, talks about the limits model of disability. And something that I love that she says is disability is an unsurprising part of the human condition. It would be more surprising if there were not disabled people. And I think about that with need and care too. It would be more surprising if we didn't need care. And it would be more surprising if we couldn't offer care. Both needing and offering care are just integral, unsurprising parts of what it means to be human. And so I think the sacredness really comes from recognizing that and being in two-way communication about how we care with and for and among each other. I really like this question about God caring, and I think in interdependent language, how we care for God. Someone in a disability group that I'm part of, as we were talking through some of these cure narratives in the Bible, which is what a lot of disability theology has been kind of forced to focus on, that comes up so often. And we were talking about this passage, and someone said, all of Jesus' ministry, he spends so much time with these disabled people. And then in Nancy Eastland's model, he becomes disabled. And thinking about these disabled people throughout his life and ministry, teaching him how to survive also as a disabled person. And I really loved that imagery about Jesus spending time with these people, not only being in maybe a complicated kind of cure-heal relationship, but then later in his life when he becomes disabled, I like to think that he was thinking back to all of the ways that he learned from these other disabled people he encountered in his ministry about how to make it as a disabled person himself. And so I think of that as kind of a two-way relationship of God offering care, God in the form of Jesus, offering this, again, maybe complicated care to these disabled people throughout his life, and them offering him this witness and companionship and sense of solidarity when he joins the ranks of disabled folks, as so many people will.
Yeah, that's such a wonderful thought, to think that God and that Jesus learns from us. It's very mind-blowing to me.
Yeah.
Very meta. Okay. Yeah, very meta. Yeah, and I hope we could come back to some of this idea of, the interdependence of God, even within God's self, on the podcast maybe later, just to ponder over. All right, so we've been talking about interdependence so far. So where did you first hear about interdependence? There's a quote that's in your piece about it. So is that where you first heard about it? And can you tell us a little bit more about why it's important to you?
Yeah, so I'd say I'd heard people kind of talk about interdependence in these like kind of lefty justice-y circles with not maybe as much citation as would have been appropriate. I really learned about interdependence from the writing of Mia Mingus, who's a disabled person of color who writes, who's part of the Sins Invalid Collective, and does a lot of transformative justice work with the Bay Area Transformative Justice Coalition. And so her work really is at the intersection of disability and accountability in a transformative justice sense. And it's from her writing that I really learned about interdependence, and she's who I cite in my paper. And Mia Mingus has beautiful things to say about interdependence. I really recommend that you read some of her work on her blog, which is called Leaving Evidence. But she talks about interdependence kind of fundamentally as turning towards each other. And that's one of the pieces that I quote in this piece: turning towards each other. When we turn towards each other, we ultimately are turning towards ourselves, in this sense that like we all need each other. We are all going to face challenges in our life that require us to care. So interdependence is really this kind of queering of what could be independence, which again, I just want to say, it's just not true. None of us are independent. We all need other people. We all need other beings. We all need, you know, plant life and other forms of creation. No one is independent. It's just a lie. But it also is not codependent. It's also not kind of an unhealthy, you know, kind of outsourcing our own identity onto another person, right? It's not that sort of reliance. But interdependence is really kind of this third space, this queering that says we can both be our full selves and need each other. And in fact, that's the only way that any of us are going to make it. And again, it comes back to this idea that we all have something to offer and we all have something to receive. And I'll say one thing about interdependence that a way that I've kind of shifted my thinking on interdependence over the years is I think kind of the first couple times that I was reading about interdependence or talking about it, I kind of told myself this story about like, oh yes, and half the time we offer things and half the time we receive things. And like over the course of our life, it kind of nets out to zero. And that's just not true. Like some of us will like need more care than we're able to offer. Some of us will offer more care than we're able to receive. We also, you know, offer lots of other things, our resources and our time and our company and our creativity, right? It's not always, you know, I don't know, helping people transfer from a wheelchair or, you know, giving people their meds. But it doesn't always net out to 50-50, I guess is what I'm saying. And that's really been a shift for me, is to understand that it doesn't have to net out to 50-50 in like one individual person's life, or even, you know, a community's collective life. But understanding that there is enough in the world. Interdependence relies on abundance. There is enough in the world, enough care, enough resources, enough company, enough community to get us through together. And so it doesn't have to be kind of a net zero on any one person. So when I talk about interdependence, it really involves like a community. It involves all of us. It involves everyone, so that there is enough, and it's not just forcing people to give when they can't, or pretending that some of us can give what is not possible for us to give.
Yeah, for sure. I might add too, like in my own sort of like journey with madness and cripness and stuff, I've had to learn, thank God for my therapist, with the help of my therapist, to accept care too. Because I found for myself, I often resisted care. I often in my life have kind of like turned inward and done most of the caring for myself. So my own journey has also been like allowing people to care for me, which is probably a whole other ball of wax, but that's been so important to me in my journey.
Yeah, totally. Well, and it's so much harder to accept care when it is like coercive or like feels bad, right? And like so much easier to accept care when it feels like trusting and respectful and autonomous and agential. And it just, makes it easier and makes me feel better about accepting care.
For sure.
So we wondered how this Mad and Crip interdependence might be its parents, like in faith communities or in academic theological institutions where, it should be the case that we're living into this stuff as Christians who care for one another, as people of faith who receive and give, but in my experience, it's been more complicated to offer that model to the church and to university life and all that. So I wondered if you had any wisdom to share.
Yeah, I like my first thought about this question is I have a friend who likes to say like, oh, that'll come in the new heaven and the new earth. They're like, you'll know in the new heaven and the new earth. And that's like my first response is like, faith communities will practice interdependence in the new heaven and the new earth. Like it just feels so far away from like how faith communities operate. Like I'm just so with you, Miriam. It just feels like not in this realm is that going to happen. But I do, and I have this story that I tell about. This was years ago. Really, is when I like first was coming out to myself as disabled, which is probably why I remember it so clearly. But I went to this conference at a church near me about like disability ministry or something, and I use that phrase specifically, disability ministry. And I want to come back to this. But it was a conference about disability ministry, and they were talking about how to be inclusive and accessible and welcoming to people with mental health issues or madness. I'm sure they use the language of mental health issues. Anyway, and at the end of this conference, like a 2-day conference, is what they've talked about the whole time. At the end of this conference, the presenter's like, does anybody have any questions? And someone raises their hand and says, well, if we're accessible to disabled people and people with mental health issues, aren't they going to come here? It's just like this shocking moment for me of like, you went through all of this and you are so scared of like disabled and mad people being in your space. Like you just cannot even square with the fact that like you're doing something that's gonna like increase the incorporation and the welcome of your space. And so when I think about like how can faith communities be interdependent, one of those times where I'm like, it's in our tradition, you guys. It is deeply in our Christian tradition to like practice interdependent care, to show up for each other, to be here in love. Like we have all the theological resources we need, like the importance of bodies, right? Like communion, Eucharist, like bodies are like the most important thing, especially coming from a Catholic tradition. It's like all about the frickin' body, man. But when it actually like comes into our church, we suddenly like totally, lose our shit about how to care for people with different kinds of bodies. So I think we have all the resources of faith communities. Yeah, right. So like we have all the theological resources we need as faith communities. We just need to tap into them. And so I think faith communities can be incredible hubs of things like mutual aid, right? It's like a lot of faith communities have a concentrated amount of resources, of many different kinds, resources like space, resources like money, resources like printers or vans or, gender neutral bathrooms, whatever it is. Like churches have resources of people, organized people, right? And organized money is what makes so much of our change in the world. And so I think that churches have a lot of capacity to be hubs for interdependent care. I just think so frequently instead of that, the church kind of defaults to either kind of outright exclusion, like what I experienced at that conference, or these really kind of condescension and control models of like, I go back to this phrase of disability ministry. I can be very wary of people who talk about doing disability ministry as opposed to things like disability theology or disability inclusion or disability solidarity, because so often what they mean by ministry is tied up in this condescension, in this kind of infantilization, in this, like, again, putting disabled people as either the angels or the burdens, right? Not allowing for this kind of mediocrity that is like weirdly our goal. And so I think like churches there's a lot of potential in terms of kind of the organization of churches to be real hubs for interdependence. And I think like we can, live into that call either on this side of heaven or on the other side, and I'm really pulling for this side.
Me too. This has been delightful. We wondered if we probably didn't cover everything, but other things you want to chat about some more or questions for us?
A couple things that I always want to do is I want to be really clear about kind of citing my sources and how I got to my politics. And I want to just explicitly cite the disability justice movement as a group and a movement that's deeply formed me as a white, cisgender, lesbian, disabled and mad person. The disability justice movement is started by mad and disabled queer and trans people of color. There is an incredible article called the Disability Justice Primer, which is released by Sins Invalid. The 10 Principles of Disability Justice, released by Sins Invalid. I really encourage you to look both of those up. And that's really deeply formed kind of my own disability politics, and this idea that our disability politics are informed by every aspect of our identity. And this idea of the leadership of the most marginalized is really important, also a big part of the disability justice movement. So I just want to be aware that a lot of kind of disability theology, disability rights work has been dominated by white disabled people with a lot of access to resources, people like me. And I really want to be clear about I got to the politics that I have and the kind of perspectives on disability that I do explicitly from the leadership and education of Black and brown, queer and trans disabled folks.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks so much for talking about that. We always want to try to get good resources into people's hands on this podcast. And I might add to that, like Miriam and I think Miriam still thinks this is true. Miriam, you please correct me if you don't still think this is true, but we often talk about how disability theology really lags behind disability, like critical disability studies, disability justice, yada yada. We're so behind. Like we need to catch up. We're like 20 years behind. I don't know, Miriam, if you think that's correct. I think mad study, like does mad theology even exist? I don't know. This idea of like the Bible and mental health, these books are just coming out now. So in my opinion, like mental health and Christian theology stuff is really behind, probably even more behind than disability theology. So we need to catch up. We need to kind of catch up in our own Crip way and Crip time. But I hope that like having conversations like this and pointing people to good resources will help facilitate some of that catching up, and also interrogation of some of the very shitty disability theologies or mental health theologies that exist. Because oh my God, there's some really bad ones. Very sort of, like paternalistic, condescending. I was reading I'm still working on my dissertation. I'm gonna get there, people, I promise. But I was doing in one of my chapters, I was reading biblical commentaries on the story of the Gerasene demoniac from Mark chapter 5. And so circling around the story for a very long time, because the Gerasene demoniac is a person in the Bible who self-injures. And my dissertation is on self-injury. And so actually one of the commentators who I read called the Gerasene demoniac disgusting. And it's like, are we really, is this really, it can't be. I was like, I like almost like threw the book across the room. I just couldn't believe that we're still talking this way. Like we're so, anyways, I'll get off my soapbox now that we're behind. But yeah, it bothers me that we're so behind.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. And dear anonymous person, it, it's been great, and I think your work and my work, I use Mia Mingus a lot, so I love her.
Yeah.
And Amy's work all contributes to bringing in learnings from problematic communities and studies. So we're grateful to meet another kindred in this work, another kin in this work. So thank you.
Well, thank you both for having me. It's so good to talk and community and learn from each other. And it's just been, yeah, delightful is the word, Miriam. It's been so delightful to have this conversation with you both.
Right. We hope you contribute again to the podcast. Yeah.
Well, thank you both for all the work that you do with the journal and the podcast. It's so exciting. I'm totally with you, Amy, about the lag behind, and even to have a podcast called the Mad and Crip Theology podcast, I mean, was just like, I just, ran to submit something. Even just the language use was really exciting to me and showed me that, yeah, these are kindred spirits. So I'm really appreciate all the ministry, the ministry that you both do in a non-condescending, non-patronizing sort of way. Really good, great solidarity.
Awesome.